She rode into Dust Creek with $43, a mule that hated her, and a debt that could swallow a man whole, let alone a woman nobody wanted. They looked at her like she was a problem someone else had forgotten to deal with. Too heavy, too plain, too poor to matter. But Tessa Holloway had buried her father with her own hands and walked away from the only home she'd ever known. And she wasn't done fighting yet. When she saw Rhett Calloway's notice nailed to the post outside the general store, something cold and calculating woke up inside her. He needed saving. So did she. Neither of them knew what that desperation was about to cost them. If this story already has you hooked, hit that like button, drop your city in the comments, and follow along. I want to see how far this one travels. The morning Tessa Holloway rode into Dust Creek, the sky was the color of a bad bruise, purple at the edges, yellowing toward the middle, like the land itself had taken a beating and hadn't quite healed. She sat on the buckboard seat of a wagon that wasn't hers anymore, technically, pulled by a mule named George, who expressed his opinions about life through selective deafness and a tendency to stop dead in the middle of the road for no reason anyone could identify. George stopped now, right in the center of Main Street, while a pair of men in clean boots watched from the boardwalk with the particular amusement of people who have nowhere pressing to be. "Come on," Tessa said, low and flat. She clicked her tongue. She slapped the reins. George considered the request and declined. She climbed down, walked to his head, grabbed his halter, and pulled. He came. Not because she'd convinced him, but because he'd made his point and was ready to move on. That was George. That was also, she thought, a lot of men she'd known. Dust Creek was the kind of town that had started out hoping to be something and settled for existing. 2 saloons, a general store with a porch that sagged on one side, a sheriff's office that looked like it might blow over in a stiff wind, and a scattering of buildings that couldn't quite decide if they were permanent structures or very committed tents. The street was hard-packed dirt, bone-dry even in spring, and every surface wore a fine layer of the reddish dust that gave the place its name. She tied George to a post outside the general store and went inside to ask about boarding. The man behind the counter, thick through the middle, with a mustache that worked hard to compensate for a receding hairline, looked at her the way people had been looking at her since she'd left the Holloway farm, like she was a problem in search of a category. "Room's $1.50 a week," he said. "Stable's another 50 cents. "I'll need work first," she said. "Anything in town hiring?" He scratched his chin, made a show of thinking about it. "We ain't exactly got a surplus of positions for, He paused just long enough to be insulting. "Women without particular skills." "I can keep books," Tessa said. "I ran the accounts on a working farm for 6 years. I can inventory, manage supply lines, track debt schedules, and I'm faster at figures in my head than most men are on paper." He looked at her like she'd started speaking a foreign language. "That a fact," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a dismissal dressed up as a response. She bought a tin of crackers with money she could barely spare and went back outside. George was trying to eat the post. She pushed his nose away and stood on the boardwalk eating crackers and looking at the street, because that was what you did when you had no good options. You stood still, and you looked, and you waited for one to appear. That was when she saw the notice. It was tacked to the post right next to where George had been chewing, which meant she'd walked past it twice without registering it. A square of paper, slightly crooked, the handwriting blunt and practical rather than elegant. Seeking. A capable woman for the position of ranch manager and household keeper. Iron Mesa Ranch. Arrangement of practical nature, terms to be discussed. Inquire at the land office or ask for Rhett Calloway at the Dusty Boot Saloon, Fridays. She read it twice. Then she folded the rest of the crackers into her pocket, untied George, and asked the nearest person what day it was. Friday. Attempt. The Dusty Boot was the better of the 2 saloons, which was not saying much. It had a floor, which the other one didn't, and a back room that could be rented for conversations of a private nature. Tessa went in through the front door, which she could tell by the brief silence that settled over the room was not the expected approach. Women came in through the side, if they came in at all. She walked to the bar anyway. "I'm looking for Rhett Calloway," she said to the bartender. He tilted his head toward the back without a word. The man sitting at the corner table looked up when she came in, and she took stock of him the same way she'd have assessed a piece of land, methodically, without sentiment. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, built like someone who worked with his hands and had been doing it long enough that it showed in the shape of his shoulders. Dark hair, 3 days past a shave, wearing a good shirt that had seen better care. His eyes were sharp, the kind of sharp that came from watching things go wrong and trying to figure out why. He looked at her with no particular expression, which she appreciated more than she would have expected. "You hear about the notice?" he said. "I am." "Sit down then." She sat. He studied her the way she'd studied him. Straightforward, no pretense about it. "You've done ranch work?" he said. "I've done farm work, which is related but not identical. I haven't managed livestock at scale, but I've managed a working property with 6 employees, tracked inventory, handled banking correspondence, and kept a debt ledger current through 3 bad seasons. My father was Amos Holloway. He ran Holloway Farm outside Callow Creek." Something shifted in his face. "Holloway Farm? That place went under." "Yes," she said. "It did." "Your father died in November. The debt passed to me. The bank moved on the property in February." She kept her voice level. "I'm not here to talk about that. I'm here because I read your notice, and I think I understand what you're actually asking for." He leaned back. "Do you?" "You're not looking for a housekeeper," she said. "Not primarily. The word practical arrangement means something specific, and the fact that you're advertising in a saloon on the main street rather than through a marriage broker or a church notice means you're not after the traditional version of things. You need someone who can work. You put the housekeeper part in because it sounds more respectable than what you're actually after, which is someone who can help keep a property from collapsing." Silence. Rhett Calloway looked at her for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, something that wasn't quite a smile moved at the corner of his mouth. "The ranch is in trouble," he said. It seemed to cost him something to say it. "I assumed. Men with healthy ranches don't post notices in saloons." He picked up his glass, looked into it, set it back down without drinking. "Iron Mesa was my grandfather's. He built it from nothing, 300 acres to start. Now it's closer to 900. Water rights on the creek, which is the only reason we've survived the dry years. My father ran it after him, and then I ran it after my father." He paused. "I'm not a bad rancher." "I didn't suggest you were. But I'm not a businessman," he said. "And somewhere in the last 4 years, the business part of it started falling apart, and I couldn't get in front of it fast enough. Accounts I didn't know were falling behind, supply contracts that weren't being honored, men on payroll who weren't doing the work they were paid for." He rubbed the back of his neck. "Last season, I lost more money than I made. This season, if things don't change, I'm not sure the bank doesn't end up owning what my grandfather built." Tessa was quiet for a moment. She was thinking, and she didn't bother pretending she wasn't. "What are the terms you had in mind?" she said. "Legal arrangement," he said. "On paper. You come out to Iron Mesa, you work the management side of the property, books, accounts, supply, the business of it. In exchange, I cover your room and board, a small salary while you're getting things in order, and—" he seemed to search for the right words. "Stability. Something solid under your feet while you figure out what's next." "That's not marriage," she said. "That's employment." "It's both," he said. "On paper, it's marriage, because it's the only arrangement that gives you full authority on the property. A hired woman can be ignored. A ranch owner's wife is harder to dismiss." He met her eyes. "You'd have standing, legal standing. That matters when you're trying to get men who've been doing things their own way for years to actually listen." She turned that over. It was practical. It was also more thought through than she'd expected. "And personally," she said, "what are you expecting?" He was direct about it, which she respected. "I'm not expecting anything that isn't freely offered. This isn't that kind of arrangement unless it becomes something different on its own terms. What I need is someone capable running the parts of this operation I'm not good at. I'll do my work. I'll expect you to do yours." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the $43 in her coat pocket. She thought about the debt she couldn't pay and the property she couldn't recover, and the man in the general store who'd looked at her like she was a problem. She thought about standing on the boardwalk eating crackers, which was, she realized, probably the lowest point she'd reached so far. "I'll need to see the books before I agree to anything," she said. "If the situation is unsalvageable, I won't pretend otherwise, and I won't waste either of our time." "Fair enough. I'll also need it in writing. The terms you've described: salary, authority on the management side, and clarity about what the arrangement does and doesn't include personally. Also fair. And if I find problems you didn't tell me about, you probably will, he said. It wasn't defensive, it was honest. I don't know the full shape of it yet, and that's part of why I need someone who does. She looked at her hands on the table. Solid hands, work rough and not particularly elegant. She'd always been embarrassed of them when she was younger. She'd stopped being embarrassed somewhere around the second bad season at Holloway Farm. All right, she said. Show me the books. They rode out to Iron Mesa the next morning, Tessa on the buckboard with George, who decided to behave, apparently having run out of commentary, and Rhett on a gray horse that moved with the unhurried confidence of an animal that had made this trip 1,000 times. The road out of Dust Creek ran east for 3 miles before cutting north through grassland that rolled out in every direction, brown gold in the spring light, still not fully awake from winter. Iron Mesa Ranch came into view gradually. The main house first, a 2-story structure built from timber and stone that had started life as something modest and been added onto in sections as the family's fortunes allowed. The additions didn't quite match, which gave the whole thing a slightly improvised look, like a sentence that had been revised too many times. Behind it, a barn that was genuinely impressive, a stable block, a bunkhouse, several outbuildings in varying states of repair, and beyond all of it, the land, rolling grassland broken by rocky outcroppings, with the line of willows along Decker Creek just visible in the middle distance. It was, Tessa thought, a lot of property for one man to manage alone. She asked Rhett how many hands he kept. 8 full-time, he said. Plus day labor in season. Used to be 12, but I had to cut back. Who handles supply? Man named Purvis, Walt Purvis. He's been doing it since my father's time. And the accounts? I've been managing what I can. A pause. Which is apparently not as much as I thought. The books were in the ranch office, a small room off the main hall that smelled of pipe tobacco and old leather and the particular staleness of a space that got used for unpleasant purposes. Rhett set 2 ledgers on the desk and stood back while Tessa sat down and began to work. She didn't speak while she read. She turned pages, made small marks in pencil on a separate sheet of paper she'd brought in her bag, went back to cross-reference entries, turned more pages. Rhett came in, went out, came back with coffee, left again. After an hour, he appeared in the doorway. Well, he said. I need more time. He nodded and left her to it. It was 2 more hours before she looked up. Her coffee had gone cold. Outside the small window, the angle of the light had changed, and she could hear the sound of the ranch doing its afternoon work. Horses, voices, the distant rhythm of something being hammered somewhere. She found Rhett in the barn, overseeing the treatment of a horse that had thrown a shoe and come back with a cut leg. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway and said something to the hand working on the horse, then came over. Tell me, he said. She had her notes in her hand. She didn't need them. She had it all in her head already, but she'd found that people received bad news better when it was attached to paper. Made it feel less like accusation and more like evidence. The simple version, she said, is that you have a leak, possibly more than one. Your supply costs over the last 3 years have been running about 30% higher than your documented inventory would justify, meaning you're paying for things that either aren't being delivered at the quantities claimed or aren't being delivered at all. I can't tell you yet which it is. Rhett's jaw tightened. Your payroll is clean, she said, because she believed in giving the full picture. The men you're paying, you're getting work from. The records are consistent on that. The problem is on the supply side and in some of the debt management. You've got 3 outstanding obligations that should have been retired 6 months ago that are still sitting on the books, and the interest on those is compounding in a way that's going to become serious inside of a year. How serious? The kind of serious where the bank starts looking at your water rights as an asset they'd like to own, she said plainly. He was quiet for a moment. A muscle worked in his cheek. Can it be fixed? He said. I don't know yet, she said. I need to see actual supply delivery records, not just the purchase orders, if they exist. I need to talk to Walt Purvis, and I need to understand the debt structure more clearly before I can tell you whether you're looking at a recovery problem or a survival problem. There's a difference? A significant one. Recovery means we tighten things down, find the leak, stop the bleeding, and work back toward healthy. Survival means we cut everything to the bone and hope we can hold on long enough for conditions to change. She paused. I think you're somewhere between the two right now. That means there's still room to work. He looked at her steadily. You said yes before you knew how bad it was. I said I'd look at the books before I agreed to anything, she corrected. I've now looked at the books. I'm still here. Something moved across his face that she couldn't quite read. Not gratitude exactly, more like a man who'd been bracing for a door to close and found it still open. So you're agreeing, he said. I'm agreeing, she said, on the terms we discussed, and I want to speak to Walt Purvis first thing tomorrow morning. They went to the county clerk the following afternoon and signed the papers. The clerk, a thin man named Garvey with ink-stained fingers, looked at them both across the desk with the expression of someone who had seen a great many strange arrangements pass through his office and had learned to process them without comment. Iron Mesa Ranch property, Garvey said, reading back from the document. Joint ownership registered to Rhett Allen Calloway and Tessa Mae Holloway Calloway. He looked up. The lady needs to sign here. Tessa signed. Her handwriting was clear and practical. No flourishes, no sentiment. Rhett signed beside it. Garvey stamped the paper, folded it, handed them each a copy, and that was the end of that. They rode back to the ranch without much conversation. Tessa was thinking about supply chains, and Rhett was, she suspected, thinking about the fact that he'd just handed a woman he'd met 2 days ago a legal claim to his family's land. She might have been thinking about that too, if she'd been him. But she wasn't him. She was herself, which meant she was thinking about the 30% discrepancy and what it implied about Walt Purvis. The ranch hands were at supper when they got back, and Rhett brought her into the bunkhouse to introduce her. 8 men, ranging from a boy who couldn't have been more than 17 to a weathered hand in his 50s named Dutch, who looked like he'd been carved out of jerked beef. They received the news with the full range of responses she'd expected. The youngest looked curious. Dutch looked neutral in a way that suggested he was reserving judgment, and 3 others in the middle looked at her the way men looked at things they weren't sure how to categorize. A man named Purvis sat at the far end of the table. She'd worked out which one he was before Rhett named him. He was the one whose expression went briefly, carefully blank when Rhett announced that Tessa would be taking over management of the ranch's accounts and supply operations. The one who collected himself just a half-second too slowly. Walt Purvis was in his 40s, heavy-set in the way of a man who'd been strong once, and kept the bulk as the strength diminished. He had good manners and a comfortable manner and the kind of practiced, easy smile that tended to work on people who weren't paying close attention. Tessa paid close attention. Welcome to Iron Mesa, Mrs. Calloway, Purvis said, smooth as river rock. Zvunka. Thank you, Mr. Purvis, she said. I'll want to sit down with you tomorrow. Go through the supply records in detail. I'm still getting oriented. Of course, he said. Happy to help. She smiled at him, and he smiled at her, and both of them knew, she thought, that something had just begun. She slept that night at the ranch house's spare room, which had been used for storage and smelled like it. She'd moved enough boxes to clear a path to the bed, which was solid and actually comfortable once she'd shaken out the quilt. Through the wall she could hear the old house settling, the small cracks and groans of timber that had been absorbing weather for 40 years. She lay in the dark and thought about the books, the 30%, the debt schedules, the way Purvis's face had gone smooth when he heard her name attached to management. She'd spent her whole life watching men underestimate what she was capable of. Her father, who'd loved her genuinely and deeply, had still spent years assuming her brother would take over the farm before her brother had made different choices and gone elsewhere, and necessity had made it hers. The bank officers, when she'd come to them after Amos died, trying to discuss restructuring, who had looked at her and seen a problem rather than a negotiating party. The man in the general store in Dust Creek. Purvis would underestimate her. She was counting on it. She turned onto her side, pulled the quilt up, and thought about leverage and documentation and the specific arithmetic of what it would take to close a 30% gap. Then she went to sleep because she had work to do in the morning and sleep was not something she was willing to waste. At breakfast, Rhett made eggs. They weren't good eggs. He'd gotten distracted by something outside and let them go rubbery. But he put them on the table without apology or comment, which was a reasonable approach to a reasonable failure, she thought. How do you want to handle Purvis, he said. She hadn't told him her specific suspicion yet. She'd wanted to see the man first. I want to go through 3 years of supply receipts against inventory records, she said. Everything that was ordered, everything that was delivered, and the dates. Cross-referenced. Purvis keeps those. I know. I'd like you to ask him to bring them to the office at 9. Should I sit in? She thought about it. Not at first. Let me talk to him alone. Rhett looked at her over his coffee cup. You think it's him? I think there's something wrong on the supply side, and he's the supply side, she said carefully. That's all I know for certain at this point. Purvis has been here since my father, Rhett said. His voice had something careful in it, too. Not defensiveness, but the particular caution of a man working to be fair. He's always been straight with me, far as I knew. Far as you knew, she said. A pause. Yeah, he said quietly. Far as I knew. The morning with Purvis was an education. He brought the records as asked, carried them in with the easy helpfulness of a man with nothing to hide, and sat across from Tessa in the small office smelling of old tobacco while she went through them with the systematic patience of someone doing arithmetic rather than conducting an interrogation. Which was, of course, exactly the point. She started with a year she already knew was clean. She'd calculated it from the main ledger, and walked him through it question by question, letting him get comfortable. Delivery dates, quantities, vendor contacts. She took notes, asked follow-ups, nodded at answers. He relaxed. His answers got a little longer, a little less precise. Then she moved to the following year. This delivery in March, she said, pointing to a line in the record. 200 pounds of feed grain from Alderman's in Coopersville. That's right. Do you have the vendor receipt? A flicker, small. Should be in there. She turned pages. I'm not seeing it. Maybe it got misfiled. These records go back a ways. Of course. She moved on, noted it in her own record without comment, found 2 more missing receipts before she hit the pattern she'd been looking for, a consistent drift between order quantities and delivery quantities that appeared in the documentation for one specific category of goods across one specific vendor relationship at intervals of 3 to 4 months. Not random, structured. Someone who knew how to make things look like accounting error rather than design. Mr. Purvis, she said, in the same mild tone she'd used for the last 2 hours, who handles the count when feed deliveries come in? Usually one of the boys. Which boys specifically? A hesitation. Varies. Is there a log? Should be in the... I'd have to check. Could you check today? I can see what I can find. She looked up from the papers and met his eyes directly. He held it well. Better than most would have. His smile didn't even flicker. Thank you, she said pleasantly. I appreciate your patience. This is all very helpful. He left, and she sat alone in the office for a few minutes. She was piecing it together slowly, deliberately, making sure she wasn't filling in gaps with assumption. But the shape of it was becoming visible. A steady skimming, not dramatic, nothing that would jump out at casual examination, just a consistent small percentage on certain deliveries over a long period of time. Small enough to hide in normal variance, large enough, compounded over 3 years, to account for most of what she was seeing in the ledger discrepancy. Rhett appeared in his doorway. How'd it go? She looked up. I need to write some letters, she said, to the vendors on file, and I need to know if there's a deputy in this county or if we're working with the sheriff directly. He was quiet for a moment. It's that serious? I don't know yet what it rises to legally, she said honestly. But yes, I think it's serious. He's K. He came in and sat down across from her, elbows on the desk, and she recognized the look on his face. The look of a man processing something he hadn't wanted to be true. I trusted him, Rhett said. Not complaining, just stating a fact. I know, she said. Most people trust the person who's been there the longest. It's reasonable. Reasonable got me taken advantage of. Reasonable got you here, she said, where someone can actually help you fix it. He looked at her for a moment. Yeah, he said, and something in his voice shifted slightly. Something that might have been the beginning of trust, if trust was the kind of thing that built itself out of 2 people looking at a problem the same way. I guess that's right. Outside, the ranch was going about its afternoon work. The horses moved in the corral. Dutch was doing something with fence posts on the far side of the property. The boy, she'd learned his name was Pete, was leading a pair of geldings toward the stable, singing something quietly to himself that she couldn't quite make out. Iron Mesa, she thought. 900 acres and a creek with water rights and a family's worth of history pressed into the timber of the walls. It was worth saving. She picked up her pen and started writing letters. The letters went out on a Tuesday. By Friday, 2 had come back. The first was from Alderman's Feed and Supply in Coopersville, a polite, somewhat confused response from the owner, a man named Gerald Alderman, who confirmed that, yes, he'd been doing business with Iron Mesa Ranch for going on 7 years. And yes, he was happy to provide a complete record of all deliveries and their documented quantities if that would be helpful. He included, without being asked, a note that he'd always found Mr. Purvis to be a reliable contact, which Tessa read twice and set aside. The second letter was from a freight broker named Cobb, who handled goods out of the rail depot in Harlan, 40 miles east. This one was less polite and more useful. Cobb wrote in the cramped, impatient hand of a man who didn't enjoy correspondence, but what he said was clear enough. The quantities he'd delivered to Iron Mesa on behalf of 2 vendors over the past 3 years did not match the quantities listed on the purchase orders filed under the ranch's account. He'd noticed the discrepancy himself 6 months ago and had assumed it was a clerical error on the ranch's end. He'd meant to write about it. He was glad someone had finally asked. Tessa sat at the desk in the ranch office and read Cobb's letter 3 times. Then she went to find Rhett. He was at the corral, working a young mare through a series of movements that required his full attention. She waited at the fence until he brought the horse around to her side and pulled up. Cobb wrote back, she said, and handed him the letter through the fence rails. He read it on horseback, which said something about him, that he could absorb bad news without needing to sit down first. His expression didn't change much, but his jaw set in a way she was beginning to recognize. "How much?" he said. "I'm still calculating the full figure, but based on what Cobb's records show against what's in the ledger," she paused. "Conservatively, somewhere between $400 and $600 over 3 years." He looked at the letter again. Then he folded it and handed it back through the fence, and for a moment he just sat there on the mare while she moved under him, shifting her weight, impatient with stillness. "I need to confront him," Rhett said. "No," Tessa said. He looked down at her. "Tessa, not yet," she said. "If you confront him now, we lose the ability to document what he's done completely. He'll deny it, call it clerical error, and we have 2 letters and some arithmetic, which isn't enough to bring to a sheriff and have it go anywhere useful." She looked up at him steadily. "I need 3 more weeks, maybe 4. I want a complete record." He didn't like it. She could see that plainly. He was the kind of man whose instinct ran toward direct action rather than patience. But he was also, she was coming to understand, the kind of man who could override his instincts when the argument was sound. 3 weeks, he said. Possibly 4. And in the meantime, he's still here. Still on my property. Yes. And he needs to keep thinking everything is fine. She met his eyes. Can you manage that? A beat of silence. I've managed worse, he said, and turned the mare back toward the center of the corral. The work settled into a rhythm that was harder than she'd expected and more satisfying than she would have admitted out loud. Mornings, she was in the office by 6, before the ranch hands came in for breakfast, going through records while the light was good and the house was quiet. Mid-mornings, she'd usually be out walking the property with whoever was working whatever section she needed to understand. Supply storage, equipment condition, the state of the south pasture fencing that 3 of the hands had been meaning to address since winter and hadn't quite gotten to. Afternoons were for correspondence, calculation, and the slow, painstaking work of building a clear picture of what Iron Mesa actually looked like financially versus what the existing books suggested it looked like. The picture was getting clearer, and the clearer it got, the more complicated it became. Purvis's operation, she'd started thinking of it as an operation because that was what it was neater than she'd initially thought. He hadn't been simple about it. He'd layered the discrepancies across multiple vendor relationships, kept individual amounts small enough to read as normal variance, and kept his personal manner so consistently helpful and untroubled that a man without her particular skills would have missed it for years more. Maybe indefinitely, but there was something else in the records that started pulling at her attention around the end of her second week, and she almost missed it because she was focused on Purvis. A name kept appearing in correspondence. Not a vendor, not a supplier, a creditor. Blackthorn Land and Finance, out of Harlan. They held one of the outstanding debt obligations Tessa had flagged in her first review, a loan taken against the ranch's eastern acreage 3 years ago, during a bad season when Rhett's father had still been alive, and the book showed a short-term cash crisis. The loan was substantial. The interest terms, which she had to request separately from the Harlan Land Office because they weren't fully documented in the ledger, made her go still when she read them. She set the document down, picked it up again. The interest structure wasn't punishing by design. It was punishing by strategy. Written in language that sounded reasonable at first pass, but contained a clause that allowed the lender to accelerate repayment in full under certain conditions, including a broad provision about material decline in operating capacity. It was the kind of language that meant nothing if the lender was acting in good faith, and everything if they weren't. She brought it to Rhett that evening. He was in the kitchen, attempting to fix a loose hinge on a cabinet door with the focused irritation of a man who was good at large physical tasks and specifically bad at small mechanical ones. She set the document on the table and waited while he washed his hands and sat down to read. She watched his face. It was hard to read at first, and then it wasn't. "My father signed this," he said. "Yes." He wouldn't have understood what this clause meant. He looked up. "I didn't understand what this clause meant until you just handed it to me." "Most people wouldn't," she said. "That's likely the point." "Who is Lenora Blackthorn?" Tessa had been asking that question herself for the past 3 days, quietly, through the particular method of listening carefully whenever she was in town and asking indirect questions of people who didn't know why she was asking. She'd assembled a partial picture. "She's based out of Harlan," Tessa said. "She runs a finance and land company that does business across 4 counties. From what I can gather, she has interests in mining, freight, and land acquisition. She's been operating in this region for about 8 years. She paused. "She has a reputation for patience." "What does that mean?" "It means she tends to hold debt rather than call it early. She waits until her borrowers are in the weakest possible position, and then she moves." Tessa tapped the document. "This clause, on its own, means she could argue that Iron Mesa's current financial difficulties represent a material decline in operating capacity, which would allow her to demand full repayment of this loan immediately." "How much?" She told him the number. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the spring night was doing its things. Insects, a distant coyote, the sound of Pete laughing at something from the direction of the bunkhouse. "We don't have that," Rhett said. "No. Not even close." "No. So if she calls the loan, it depends on how aggressively she pursues it," Tessa said, "and whether the clause holds up if challenged legally. It's written broadly enough that there's argument to be made on both sides." She paused. "But that's assuming she calls the loan on its own terms. What concerns me is that she might not need to." Rhett frowned. "What do you mean?" Tessa thought about how to say what she'd been thinking for the past day. She'd been reluctant to say it because it sounded like the kind of paranoid conclusion a person could reach if they looked for patterns hard enough. But she was confident enough in her arithmetic to say it now. "The supply losses," she said, "they've been going on for 3 years. This loan was taken out 3 years ago. The operating capacity of the ranch has been declining over that period, not dramatically, but steadily, in a way that happens to line up with the exact conditions that clause describes." She let that sit. "I don't know yet whether Walt Purvis knows Lenora Blackthorn. I don't know if what he's been doing is independent theft or something coordinated, but I think that's a question worth asking." Rhett stared at her. "You're saying someone might have been deliberately, sinking the ranch?" "I'm saying I don't know," she said carefully. "I'm saying the shape of what I'm looking at is consistent with that possibility, and I think we need to find out." He stood up from the table and went to the window. Stood there for a moment looking out at nothing in particular, just the dark of the yard and the shape of the barn against the sky. "This was my grandfather's land," he said. "Not to her exactly. More to the room." "I know," she said. "He broke his back building it. My father, after him." "I know that too." He turned around. His face had settled into something harder than she'd seen on him before. Not angry exactly, but resolute in a way that was close to anger's better cousin. "What do we do?" he said. She'd already been thinking about that. We keep doing what we're doing, she said. We document everything. We don't give Purvis any reason to think he's being watched, and I need to make a trip to Harlan to look at some public land records. I'll come with you. You should stay here, she said. If we both leave, it draws attention. I'll go alone. He looked like he wanted to argue. She waited him out. Fine, he said finally, but you take the good horse, not the mule. She went to Harlan on a Thursday, riding a bay horse named Carl, who had a smooth gait and good manners that made George's behavior seem, in retrospect, even more personal. The county seat was 3 hours east of Dust Creek, and she arrived just after the land office opened. The clerk there was a woman, which Tessa hadn't expected and which made certain things easier. Her name was Mrs. Ford, and she had the brisk efficiency of someone who had been doing precise work for a long time and had strong opinions about accuracy. When Tessa explained what she was looking for, public records of property transactions involving Blackthorn land and finance, Mrs. Ford didn't blink. That'll take a bit to pull, she said. You want coffee while you wait? Tessa wanted coffee badly and said so. What Mrs. Ford set in front of her 2 hours later was a stack of documented land transactions spanning the past 8 years. Tessa worked through them with the same systematic patience she'd applied to the ranch ledgers, and what emerged from that work was a portrait she hadn't quite anticipated. Blackthorn Land and Finance had acquired interests in 11 separate properties across the county in 8 years. 6 of those had resulted in full ownership transfer. The original owners had lost their properties and Lenora Blackthorn had taken possession. 3 more were still in the debt structure, the original owners still nominally in control, but locked into terms that suggested they wouldn't be for long. And 2, Iron Mesa was one, appeared to be in the earlier stages of whatever process this was. The pattern was almost elegant. Lenora Blackthorn didn't buy properties. She didn't foreclose in the straightforward sense. She acquired debt, waited for operating conditions to deteriorate, helped along, apparently, in at least some cases by factors she'd arranged, and then moved at exactly the moment when the owner had the least capacity to resist. 6 properties in 8 years. 6 families that had lost land their people had worked. Tessa sat with that number for a moment. Then she asked Mrs. Ford if she could make copies and paid the copying fee without complaint and rode back to Dust Creek with a folder of documents pressed into her saddlebag. She told Dutch about it. This was a calculated decision. Dutch had been at Iron Mesa for 22 years. He was the kind of man who watched more than he talked, which meant he saw things, and the things he saw tended to stay with him rather than circulating freely. She'd been paying attention to him since her first night at the ranch, and she'd concluded that he was not involved in whatever Purvis was doing. He was too careful and too loyal to the ranch itself, rather than to any individual on it. She found him behind the stable, working on a piece of tack with the focused patience of a man who had no intention of being rushed by anything. I want to ask you something, she said. He didn't look up. Ask. Walt Purvis. How long has he been what he is to this ranch? Dutch worked a stitch through the leather. Since Mr. Calloway Sr. hired him, 8-9 years back, came with a reference from a property over in Talon County. Did you ever check the reference? He looked up then. His eyes were the color of old denim, steady and evaluating. Wasn't my place, he said. Has anything ever seemed off to you with the supply side? Long pause. Dutch set the tack down on his knee and looked at the middle distance. Things go missing, he said finally. It's a ranch. Things go missing. I figured normal wastage. More than normal? Another pause. Longer. Maybe. He looked at her. You found something. I found several things, she said. I'm still finding them. He nodded slowly. It wasn't agreement exactly. It was acknowledgement, the kind that meant he was taking what she'd said and putting it next to things he'd already observed and seeing whether they fitted. What do you need? He said. Right now, nothing. Just for you to keep your eyes open and come to me directly if you see anything that looks like Purvis is changing his patterns. If he starts moving documents, or if someone outside the ranch comes to see him directly. She paused. I need him to keep thinking everything is normal. He's going to know something's up eventually, Dutch said. I know. I need it to be later rather than sooner. Dutch picked up the tack again. All right, he said. It wasn't enthusiasm. It wasn't a pledge. It was the quiet agreement of a practical man who had decided which side he was on, and she found it more reassuring than anything enthusiastic would have been. 3 days after she got back from Harlan, Tessa made her first significant mistake. She'd been in the office late, cross-referencing the Harlan land records against the ranch's own debt schedule, and she'd left her notes on the desk when she went to get supper. She'd come back to find them exactly as she'd left them, which should have been fine. But the lamp on the desk was burning at a slightly different angle than she'd positioned it. Not much, just a degree or two. And she had the peculiar memory of people who do detailed work and unconsciously register the position of everything on a surface. Someone had been in the room. She stood in the doorway and didn't go in immediately, just looked. Everything appeared untouched, but the lamp was wrong. And once she noticed the lamp, she noticed that the top document in her stack was facing a slightly different direction than she'd left it. Small enough to dismiss as imagination. Not small enough, if you were paying the kind of attention she paid, to dismiss as coincidence. She went in, sat down, ate her supper cold while she thought about it. Then she began carefully to reconstruct what whoever had been in here would have seen. The Harlan land records were in her saddlebag upstairs. She hadn't left those out. What was on the desk was her working summary, a list of dates, figures, and vendor names written in the shorthand she used for her own reference. It was legible if you knew what you were looking at, but it didn't give the full picture. It might, she thought, tell someone that she was looking at more than just the ranch's internal accounts, that she'd been going somewhere, that the scope of what she was investigating was broader than a simple bookkeeping audit. She finished her supper, washed the plate, and went upstairs to find Rhett. He was reading, or trying to. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway of his room. "Someone went through the office," she said. He was on his feet. "Who? I don't know for certain, but I think we have to assume it was Purvis or someone acting for him." She leaned against the doorframe. "I think he's been getting nervous, and now he knows I've been doing more than internal accounting." Rhett's jaw was tight. "I want to deal with this now, Tessa." "I know you do. He's been stealing from me for 3 years. He's been in my office going through your records. I know." She kept her voice level. "And if we move on him now, we get one man who'll claim it was theft of opportunity and probably serve minimal time, if anything. If we wait—" She stopped, started again. "Rhett, what Purvis has been doing may be connected to Lenora Blackthorne. If it is, and if we can document that connection before we move, we don't just stop the bleeding here. We can go after the whole structure." He looked at her. In the lamplight, his face was all edges and shadow and the particular tiredness of a man who had been holding something heavy for a long time. "How much longer?" he said. 2 weeks, maybe less." 2 weeks, he repeated. "I'll lock the office," she said. "I'll take my important documents upstairs every night, and I'll make sure whatever's left on the desk tells an incomplete story." She paused. "Let him think I'm making slower progress than I am. If he thinks there's still time, he won't act urgently." Rhett ran a hand through his hair. It was the gesture of a man at the edge of his patience, and she respected that he didn't pretend otherwise. "All right," he said. 2 weeks. But I'm not going past that, Tessa. Whatever you have in 2 weeks, we take it forward." "Agreed." She went back downstairs and spent an hour carefully arranging the documents on the desk, leaving enough to suggest ongoing work, removing enough to protect what mattered. When she was done, she stood back and looked at it. It looked like a woman working carefully through a complicated problem, which was, she thought, exactly what she was doing. Just not the problem Purvis was looking for. She turned down the lamp and went upstairs, and behind her, Iron Mesa settled into its nighttime sounds. And somewhere on the property, she was fairly certain, Walt Purvis was doing his own reckoning of how much time he had left. She intended to make sure that reckoning was wrong. The 2 weeks Tessa had asked for became 10 days, because on the 8th day, Dutch came to find her. She was in the supply barn doing a physical count of the grain stores, cross-referencing what was actually on the shelves against what the ledger said should be there, when she heard his boots on the barn floor and looked up to find him standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands, which was unusual. Dutch was not a hat-in-hands kind of man. "Purvis had a visitor last night," he said. "Late, after the bunkhouse was down." Tessa set her clipboard on the nearest crate. "Tell me." "Didn't recognize him. Came in from the east road, not the main approach. Tied up by the old water trough at the back of the property. The one we don't use anymore." Dutch turned his hat slowly in his hands. I was up with a sick horse in the far stable. Wouldn't have seen anything if I'd been in bed. How long did he stay? 40 minutes, maybe less. They talked outside the bunkhouse, not in it. I couldn't get close enough to hear without them seeing me. Tessa was quiet for a moment, working through what that meant. Someone coming in the back way, late, staying 40 minutes. That wasn't a social call. That was a report being given, or instructions being received, or both. Did you see which direction he rode out? East, back toward the Harlan Road. She nodded slowly. Harlan again. She thanked Dutch and told him he'd done exactly the right thing, and he put his hat back on and went back to work with the expression of a man who found gratitude slightly uncomfortable. She stood in the supply barn for a few minutes after he left, looking at the grain sacks without seeing them. The visitor from the East Road changed her timeline. If Purvis was reporting to someone, and she was now fairly certain he was, then whoever that someone worked for already knew that an audit was underway at Iron Mesa. The question was what they'd been told and what they planned to do about it. She went to find Rhett. He was at the corral, which had become something she associated with difficult conversations. He seemed to do his hardest thinking on horseback or near horses, which she supposed made sense for a man who'd grown up the way he had. She gave him Dutch's report in the same straightforward manner Dutch had given it to her. Rhett listened without interrupting, which she'd come to appreciate about him. Some men filled silences with noise because they were uncomfortable with information arriving faster than they could process it. Rhett just took it in and was quiet until he was ready. So she knows, he said. She knows something. Whether Purvis has told her the full scope of what I've found, I don't know. He may not know himself. She leaned on the fence rail. But it means the timeline has changed. If she thinks the ranch is about to close the leak she's been relying on, she may move faster. To call the loan. Possibly, or something else. She paused. I've been thinking about this since Dutch told me, and I think, instead of trying to outrun her, we should let her move. Rhett turned to look at her. Run that by me again. She'd been working out how to explain it in a way that sounded like a plan rather than a gamble, because the truth was, it was some of both. Right now she has the advantage because she knows more than we do about what she intends. But she has a weakness, which is that she doesn't know exactly what I've found. She knows I've been to Harlan. She knows I'm looking at more than internal accounts. But she doesn't know how much documentation I have on her land acquisition pattern, or that I've connected her strategy across multiple properties. So she's going to make a decision based on incomplete information. And if I'm careful about what Purvis sees by what I leave on the desk, what I let him overhear, I can make that incomplete information point in a specific direction. She looked at Rhett steadily. I can make her believe the ranch is closer to collapse than it is, that the audit is stalling, that we're more in trouble than we're letting on, and that her window to move is closing. She'll want to act before we recover enough to challenge the loan terms. And when she acts, she shows her hand, Tessa said. Whatever she does, call the loan, send someone to pressure you, anything that constitutes an overt move. It becomes part of the record. Right now, what I have on her is a pattern, suggestive, but a good lawyer could call it coincidence. What I need is an action I can attach to everything else. Rhett was quiet for a long moment. The mare at the center of the corral moved in slow circles, indifferent to everything. You want to use Purvis, he said. Like a pipe. Something like that. What if she does something we can't control? What if she goes straight to the bank and files on the loan before we can... Then we deal with that, Tessa said. But I don't think she will. From everything I've read about how she operates, she doesn't move until she's certain. She's patient. She'll want confirmation that we're in the position she thinks we're in before she commits to anything legally binding. He looked at her. You've got a lot of confidence in a woman you've never met. I've read 8 years of her work, Tessa said. That's better than meeting her. Another silence. Then, what do you need from me? Act worried, she said. Not dramatically, just let it show a little. If Purvis is watching you, let him see a man who's starting to feel the pressure. Nothing specific, just the general weight of a man whose situation is not improving. Rhett's expression shifted into something that might have been dark amusement. That shouldn't be too difficult. Also, I need access to the account books at the Dust Creek Bank. Your personal account, the ranch operating account. I want to make an entry that shows a larger outstanding obligation than there actually is. Nothing that affects the real balance. I'll reverse it when this is done. But something Purvis could see if he went looking. You want to make the ranch look worse than it is. On paper, temporarily. He rubbed the back of his neck. It was a gesture she'd catalogued as specifically belonging to moments when he was about to agree to something he wasn't entirely comfortable with. Fine, he said. What else? Tell Pete to stop fixing the south fence. Rhett frowned. That fence has been needing work since February. I know. But a ranch that's managing its operations has a maintained fence line. A ranch that's struggling doesn't. She paused. I know it's your property, and it matters to you. 2 weeks, and then Pete can fix the fence. 2 weeks, he said, with the tone of a man who had been hearing that phrase a lot lately. 10 days, she said. I think 10 days. What? She spent the next 3 days constructing a picture that was carefully, deliberately wrong. The document she left on the desk in the office, the one she knew Purvis or someone acting for him would look at, showed a woman struggling to make sense of incomplete records, circling back over the same figures without reaching conclusions. She wrote notes to herself in the margins that suggested confusion rather than progress. She made sure the most important documents, the Harlan land records, the vendor letters, the complete tally she'd built over weeks of methodical work, were locked in the strongbox she'd asked Rhett to install in the upstairs room she was using, to which only the two of them had keys. What was visible was the shell. What was real was upstairs. On the 4th day, she made a point of being in the general store in Dust Creek when she knew Purvis would be there picking up supplies. She ran into him with what she hoped read as the distracted air of a woman carrying more weight than she could comfortably manage, exchanged pleasantries and said, seemingly as an afterthought, that she was worried about the pace of the audit, that the records were more complicated than she'd expected, that she'd written to a lawyer in Harlan about the debt structure but hadn't heard back yet. Purvis absorbed all of this with his smooth, practiced sympathy. I'm sure it'll come right, he said. Ranch like Iron Mesa has weathered bad seasons before. Of course, she said, and smiled, and let something tired show around the edges of it. She rode home thinking about the fact that she'd just lied convincingly to a man who'd been lying to Rhett for 3 years, and found that she had no particular feelings about it beyond a mild professional satisfaction. The response came faster than she'd expected. On the 6th day, a letter arrived at Iron Mesa addressed to Rhett from Blackthorn Land and Finance. It was written in formal legal language, courteous on the surface and pointed underneath. It referenced the outstanding loan, expressed concern about reported difficulties in ranch operations, and indicated that given the current circumstances, Blackthorn Land and Finance would be initiating a review of the loan standing under the terms of the original agreement. A representative would be visiting Dust Creek within the fortnight to assess conditions. Rhett read it at the kitchen table. Then he put it down and looked at Tessa. She moved, he said. She moved, Tessa agreed, and faster than I predicted, which means what Purvis told her scared her. Or she's more aggressive than you calculated. Possibly. She picked up the letter and read it again. A representative visiting to assess conditions. That's important. She's not calling the loan directly. She's sending someone to look first. That's consistent with how she operates. She wants confirmation before she commits. What does that mean for us? It means we have 2 weeks, roughly, before someone shows up here and starts asking questions about the ranch's finances. She set the letter down. And it means I need to accelerate. She went to Harlan herself the next morning, taking Carl again, and spent 4 hours in Mrs. Ford's office completing the record she'd been building. She had the vendor documentation, the delivery discrepancies, the pattern of Blackthorn's acquisitions, and what she now believed was a demonstrable connection through Purvis's compensation records and the timeline of his visitor from the East Road, between the supply losses at Iron Mesa and Blackthorn's preparation to call the loan. It wasn't a complete legal case yet, but it was a foundation. She also, on this trip, stopped at the sheriff's deputy's office in Harlan, which was occupied by a man named Garrett, who had the compact, wary alertness of a former soldier and the specific expression of someone who had heard a great many stories from people hoping for official backing and had learned to wait for evidence before reacting. She gave him evidence, a summary, neatly written, with dates and figures attached. Not everything. She wasn't ready to hand over the complete documentation yet, but enough to establish that what was happening at Iron Mesa was not a simple financial dispute. Deputy Garrett read it in silence. "This is well organized," he said, which was not quite a compliment but was close to one. "I was a farm accountant," she said. He looked at her across the desk. "Mrs. Calloway, what you're describing, if it bears out, is a pattern of fraud and potentially criminal conspiracy across multiple properties. That's not something I can move on based on a summary document." "I know," she said. "I'm not asking you to move on it yet. I'm asking you to be aware that this situation exists and to be prepared to act when I bring you the complete record." "And when will that be?" "Within the month," she said. "I want to give her the opportunity to take one more step first." Garrett looked at her steadily. "You're running a trap." "I'm completing a picture," she said carefully. A pause. Then, "I'll want everything in writing when you're ready to proceed. Full documentation, signed statements from any witnesses, and anything that directly links Blackthorn to the activities at your ranch specifically, rather than just the pattern." "I'll have it," she said. She rode home thinking about what that final piece might look like and where it might come from, and the answer she kept arriving at was the one she didn't fully like. It required Lenora Blackthorn to do something directly, something that couldn't be explained away as aggressive but legal financial maneuvering. The answer came 12 days later, at 3 in the morning, when she woke to the smell of smoke. She was out of bed before she was fully conscious, moving on the instinct of a woman who had grown up on a working property where fire was the threat you never ignored. She grabbed her coat off the chair, shoved her feet into her boots without lacing them, and was in the hallway in seconds. Rhett was already there, coming out of his room, and they didn't exchange words, just went down the stairs and out the back door at the same pace. The supply barn was burning. Not catastrophically, not yet. The fire had started at the eastern corner, and the dry timber was catching fast but hadn't reached the roof peak. The horses in the adjacent stable were already reacting, the sound of them frantic and rising, and from the bunkhouse she could hear the commotion of men waking to it. "The horses first," Rhett said, and she was already moving. What followed was 45 minutes of controlled chaos. Rhett and 3 of the hands pulling horses out of the stable before the fire could spread to the shared wall, Pete working the pump at the water trough with the desperate energy of a boy who understood exactly what was at stake, Dutch organizing a bucket line with the efficiency of a man who had fought fires before and knew that panic was the second most dangerous thing after the fire itself. Tessa worked the bucket line. She wasn't the strongest person there, but she was steady, and she kept her position and kept passing buckets, and didn't stop when her arms started to burn with the effort of it. The fire took the eastern corner of the supply barn completely before they contained it. Some grain stores, a section of roof, the shelving along that wall, but it didn't spread to the stable, and it didn't reach the main barn. By 4:30 in the morning, it was out. The eastern corner of the supply barn was a blackened ruin, open to the sky. The rest of the building stood damaged but intact. They stood in the yard, all of them, breathing hard and smelling of smoke. Pete sat down in the dirt because his legs apparently gave out on him, and no one said anything about it. Rhett looked at the burned corner for a long time. "That didn't start on its own," Dutch said. He said it matter-of-factly, like he was commenting on the weather. "No," Tessa said. "It didn't." She was thinking very clearly, which surprised her. She'd expected the shock of the fire to leave her rattled, but instead she felt a cold, focused calm that she recognized as the particular mental state of someone who has just received a piece of information they needed. She walked to the eastern corner of the barn, the section that had started burning first, and crouched at the edge of the destroyed wall where the char was thickest. Rhett came to stand behind her. "What are you looking for?" "Point of origin," she said. She moved along the base of the wall, careful where she stepped. The smell was sharp and chemical under the wood smoke. Not dramatically, not obviously, just a note underneath the rest that didn't belong to burning timber alone. She stood up. "Someone helped this start," she said. "You can smell it." Rhett crouched where she'd been and inhaled, his jaw set. "I want the deputy out here," Tessa said. "Today, before anything is cleaned up or moved." "Agreed." She looked at the burned wall. The cold clarity in her head was sharpening into something else. Not anger exactly, but a very specific and practical fury, the kind that didn't cloud thinking but focused it. Someone had come onto this land in the night and put a flame to it. Someone had calculated that burning a supply barn would push a struggling ranch closer to the edge, would look like one more disaster in a string of disasters, would accelerate whatever Lenora Blackthorne's representative would see when he arrived to assess conditions. What it was instead, she thought, was the last piece of the picture. She went inside, washed the smoke off her hands and face, and went to the office. She unlocked the strongbox upstairs and brought everything down. Every document, every letter, every carefully annotated summary she'd built over 8 weeks of work. She spread it on the desk and began organizing it for the last time, pulling together the sequence that told the story from beginning to end. The supply fraud, documented across 3 years with vendor confirmation. The Blackthorne loan and its deliberately punishing clause. The pattern of acquisitions across the county, 6 properties in 8 years, the visitor from the East Road, the letter announcing a representative's visit. And now, this morning, an arson fire, deliberately set, on property belonging to a ranch that was already the subject of a predatory financial scheme. She worked until the sun came up. When Red appeared in the doorway with coffee, better than his usual efforts, or maybe she was just too tired to be critical, she looked up and said, "I'm ready." He set the coffee down and looked at the documents spread across the desk. All of it, laid out in sequence, a clear and documented line from the first theft to the fire still smoldering outside. "All of it?" he said. "All of it," she said. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the papers. Then he looked at her, at the smoke still in her hair, the dark under her eyes, the work-roughened hands wrapped around the coffee cup. "Tessa," he said, He stopped, seemed to search for what he wanted to say, and landed somewhere that was probably more honest than he'd intended. "I don't think I've said clearly enough. What you've done here, what you've built." He gestured at the documents, but she understood he meant more than the papers. "I want you to know I see it." She looked at him. There was something in his face she didn't quite know how to receive. Not gratitude exactly, because gratitude was what you felt for a service rendered. This was something adjacent to that, but more personal, more specific to her specifically, and she was tired enough that she didn't immediately put her practical wall up the way she usually would. "We're not done yet," she said. "No," he said, "but I wanted to say it anyway." She nodded, because she didn't have a better response than that, and picked up her coffee and went back to organizing documents. Outside, the sun was fully up now, and the burned corner of the supply barn stood open to it, black and raw and impossible to miss. She could hear Dutch and Pete out there already, assessing the damage with the practical efficiency of men who understood that grief and anger had their place, but work had to continue. She thought about Lenora Blackthorne in Harlan, probably waking up this morning with the comfortable confidence of a woman who believed she had just accelerated the collapse of one more piece of property she intended to own. Let her be comfortable, Tessa thought. Let her be certain. She had until the representative arrived to get to Deputy Garrett, and she didn't intend to waste a single hour of it. She capped her ink pen, stacked the documents into their correct sequence, and began writing the summary letter that would accompany everything to Harlan, clear, methodical, factual, the kind of document that didn't ask for anything dramatic, just asked that someone look at what was laid in front of them and follow the line from one end to the other. At the bottom of the last page she wrote the date, and her name, and Rhett's name beside it. Then she folded everything into the saddlebag, went to get Carl from the stable, and rode for Harlan while the morning was still cool and the road was empty and the burned smell of last night's fire was still in her coat, which was, she thought, probably the most persuasive thing she could have brought with her. Deputy Garrett was at his desk when she arrived, which meant she didn't have to wait, which was the one piece of luck the morning offered without her having to work for it. She walked in still smelling of smoke. She set the saddlebag on his desk, unbuckled it, and began laying documents out in sequence without preamble. Garrett watched her do it with the careful stillness of a man who understood that the person in front of him had not ridden 3 hours before breakfast to be interrupted. When she was done, she sat down across from him and said, "Someone set fire to our supply barn last night. The point of origin is the eastern wall, external, and there's an accelerant smell in the char that I'd like you to confirm before anything is disturbed. I've left Dutch in charge of keeping that section of the barn untouched until you can get out there." Garrett looked at the documents, then at her, then at the documents again. "Walk me through it," he said. So she did. She'd spent the 3-hour ride organizing it in her head, the sequence, the connections, the places where she had solid documentation versus the places where she had strong inference that would need corroboration. She didn't oversell the inference. She'd found that people trusted you more when you told them clearly what you didn't know as well as what you did, and Garrett struck her as the specific kind of man who would trust her less if she pretended everything was airtight when it wasn't. It took 40 minutes. Garrett asked questions twice. Once about the method she'd used to establish the delivery discrepancies, once about the timeline of the East Road visitor relative to Blackthorn's letter. Both were good questions that went to the core of the connection she was drawing. She answered them directly and didn't dress the answers up. When she finished, Garrett leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. It was not the reaction of a man who was dismissing what he'd heard. It was the reaction of a man recalculating the scope of what he was looking at. 6 properties, he said. That I found documented in the county records. There may be more in adjacent counties. And Purvis, you believe he was actively working for Blackthorn, not just independently stealing. I believe the timing and the pattern are too consistent to be coincidental, she said. He began skimming supply funds within 6 months of Blackthorn acquiring that loan. The rate of loss accelerated over 3 years in a way that corresponds almost exactly to the operating decline the loan clause uses as its trigger condition. She paused. I can't prove direct coordination yet, but I believe an investigation would find it. Garrett was quiet for a moment. Outside his window, Harlan was going about its mid-morning business. A wagon passing, voices, the sound of a door somewhere. The arson changes things, he said finally. Everything else you've described. Fraud, financial manipulation, even the scheme around the loan. That's complicated territory legally, and moving on it requires building a case carefully. But arson on occupied property is something I can act on immediately, pending physical evidence at the scene. He looked at her. I'll ride out to Iron Mesa today. This afternoon if I can get away. I'll meet you there, she said. Mrs. Calloway. He stopped her as she started gathering the documents. Leave those here. She looked at him. I need them, he said, for the investigation. I'll give you a receipt. She had copies. She'd made them in Harlan on a previous trip, precisely because she'd known this moment would come. She'd left the copies at Iron Mesa in the strongbox. She let Garrett keep the originals and accepted his written receipt, signed and dated, which she folded into her coat pocket. One more thing, she said at the door. Blackthorn is sending a representative to assess the ranch's condition. The letter said within the fortnight. That was 8 days ago. Garrett's eyes sharpened. You're telling me her man may show up before I've had time to build the case. I'm telling you her man may show up in the next 6 days, she said, and whatever he sent to assess, I'd rather you know he's coming. Garrett wrote something in the notebook on his desk. I'll be in touch with the county sheriff and the land office today. Whatever Blackthorn's representative is sent to evaluate, he's going to find that the situation has changed. She nodded and went out to Carl and rode back to Dust Creek in the early afternoon heat, thinking about what changed meant and whether it would be enough, and whether she'd moved fast enough, or whether 6 days was, in fact, cutting it dangerously close. Garrett arrived at Iron Mesa at 4 in the afternoon with another man she didn't recognize. Younger, with a surveyor's kit and the look of someone trained to read physical evidence rather than documents. They went to the burned corner of the supply barn directly, and Tessa took them there and stood back while the younger man crouched at the base of the char and did his work. It took him 20 minutes. When he stood up, he and Garrett exchanged a look that told her what she needed to know before either of them said anything. Lamp oil, the younger man said, applied to the exterior wall base. Whoever did it knew enough to do it low, where the initial flame wouldn't be visible from the house until it had enough of a hold to matter. Garrett looked at Rhett. Someone on your property? Or someone who knew the property well enough to come in quiet and go to exactly the right spot, Rhett said. His voice was controlled. He'd been controlling it, she'd noticed, since she'd gotten back, holding himself at a careful distance from the fury she could see in the set of his shoulders. The East Road, Tessa said. There's an approach from the back of the property that comes off the Harlan Road. Someone used it 11 days ago to visit Walt Purvis. She looked at Garrett. It's the same approach someone would use if they didn't want to come in through the main gate. Garrett looked at her steadily. Is Purvis on the property now? He came to breakfast, Dutch said, from where he'd been standing at the edge of the group. Didn't say anything, ate his food and went to work the same as always. I'd like to speak to him, Garrett said. What happened next was not dramatic in the way Tessa had half expected. No confrontation, no scene, no raised voices. Garrett found Purvis near the equipment shed and spoke to him quietly, and Purvis listened with his smooth, practiced composure, and then something shifted in his face as Garrett explained the nature of the conversation, and the composure cracked in the specific way of a man who has been running a calculation in his head and has just realized the numbers no longer work. He didn't confess. He was too careful for that. But he asked for a lawyer in a voice that had lost its ease, and that was, in its way, its own kind of answer. Garrett took him to Harlan that evening. He told Tessa, before he left, that he would be contacting the county sheriff and that the investigation would be broadening. He said it in the measured language of official process, but underneath it she heard what he was actually saying, that what she'd built was solid enough to move on, and that they were moving. She stood in the yard and watched Garrett's wagon go down the main road with Purvis in the back, and felt something she hadn't expected. Not satisfaction exactly, nothing as clean as that. Something more complicated. The relief of a weightlifting combined with the sudden awareness of how long she'd been carrying it. Rhett came to stand beside her. "You all right?" he said. "I think so," she said, which was honest. She wasn't entirely sure yet. He didn't say anything else, which was the right call. They stood there while the wagon disappeared around the curve of the road, and then they went inside because there was still work to do and supper to make, and tomorrow was already waiting. Optique. 3 days later, Blackthorn's representative arrived in Dust Creek. His name was Aldous Fenn, a thin man in a good suit, with the precise manner of someone who had spent years doing uncomfortable work in a professional way. He came to Iron Mesa with a letter of introduction and the stated purpose of evaluating the ranch's current operating condition per the terms of the outstanding loan. Tessa received him in the front room while Rhett sat in the corner and said nothing, which she'd asked him to do and which cost him something. She could tell. Fenn was courteous and specific. He had a list of things he wanted to assess: current inventory levels, operating accounts, staff records, evidence of the reported difficulties that had apparently reached Blackthorn's attention. He had, she noticed, a particular confidence in the way he settled into his chair, the confidence of a man who expected to find what he'd been told he would find. "Mr. Fenn," Tessa said, after she'd let him finish his introduction, "before we begin your assessment, I want to make sure you have accurate context for the ranch's current situation, because I think you may have been given information that was not entirely accurate." He looked at her with polite attention. "I'm happy to hear whatever you'd like to share, Mrs. Calloway." She had prepared for this. She had a summary document, not the complete case she'd given Garrett, but a targeted version, specifically structured to address the loan clause and its stated conditions. She set it on the table between them. "Iron Mesa's current operating situation is as follows," she said. "Over the past 3 years, the ranch experienced documented supply losses resulting from fraudulent activity by a former employee now in the custody of county authorities. That fraud, which artificially depressed our recorded inventory and inflated our operating costs, has now been identified and stopped. The accounts have been fully audited. The actual operating capacity of the ranch is substantially stronger than recent ledger figures suggested, because those figures were, in part, falsified." Fenn was still politely attentive, but something behind his eyes had gone careful. "In addition," she continued, "the pattern of debt acquisition and the specific loan terms held by Blackthorn Land and Finance are currently under review by the county deputy's office as part of a broader investigation into activities affecting multiple properties in this county." She paused. "The accelerated repayment clause in the Iron Mesa loan agreement is among the documents under review." Silence. Fenn looked at the summary document. He picked it up and read it, not skimming, actually reading, which told her he was smart enough to understand that the situation had shifted in a way he hadn't been briefed for. "I wasn't aware of a county investigation," he said finally. "I expect not," she said. He set the document down. "Mrs. Calloway, I want to be transparent with you. I was sent here to conduct an assessment, and I will conduct it. But I am also going to need to communicate to my employer that the circumstances here are not what we were led to expect." "I appreciate that," she said. "And I would encourage you to conduct a thorough assessment. I think you'll find that Iron Mesa's actual operating condition doesn't meet the threshold described in the loan clause, particularly once the fraudulent activity is factored out of the historical figures." She kept her voice even and professional. If your employer disagrees, we're prepared to have that conversation with the county land office and the court. Another silence. Fenn looked at Rhett, who was still sitting in the corner with his arms crossed and his expression carefully neutral. Is there anything you'd like to add, Mr. Calloway? Fenn said. My wife said it, Rhett said. Fenn spent 2 days at Iron Mesa conducting his assessment. He was thorough. She'd give him that. And he asked intelligent questions and looked at actual physical conditions rather than just paperwork. On the morning of his 3rd day, he came to find Tessa in the office before breakfast. I'll be riding to Harlan this morning, he said. I have a report to file. Of course. He stood in the doorway for a moment with the expression of a man who wanted to say something and was deciding whether it was appropriate. Then, the ranch's condition is better than I was told to expect, significantly. He paused. I don't know what my employer will do with that information. That's between her and the county authorities at this point, Tessa said. He nodded and left, and Tessa listened to him saddle up and ride out and sat for a moment in the quiet of the office before going back to the accounts. The investigation moved faster than she'd expected and slower than she'd hoped, which was probably the nature of all investigations. Garrett built his case over the following 3 weeks with the methodical patience of a man who wanted it to stick. He brought in the county sheriff when the scope of what he was looking at exceeded his single deputy jurisdiction. He interviewed the owners of 4 of the 6 properties she'd identified in the Harlan land records, 3 of whom, it turned out, had their own pieces of the picture that they'd never had a context in which to share. One of them was a man named Soto, who had lost his cattle operation 2 years ago under circumstances he'd always found suspicious but couldn't articulate clearly. When Garrett showed him Tessa's documentation, Soto sat across the table from the deputy and said quietly that he'd known something was wrong, but that no one had been willing to listen to a man trying to explain a financial crime he didn't have the words for. Garrett sent her a letter telling her about that conversation. She read it at the kitchen table and was quiet for a while after, thinking about the specific loneliness of being right about something and having no way to prove it. Then she wrote back to Garrett with 2 additional names she'd found in the records and hadn't mentioned yet, properties in an adjacent county that showed the same pattern. She told him she thought it was worth checking whether the investigation needed to expand its geographic scope. He wrote back 4 days later that it did. Lenora Blackthorne did not take any of this quietly or passively. Through her lawyer, she contested the investigation's jurisdiction, challenged the documentation's admissibility, and in one particularly aggressive move, filed a countercomplaint alleging that Iron Mesa Ranch had defaulted on the loan and that the investigation was being used to obstruct legitimate debt collection. It was a smart move, not because it was likely to succeed, but because it created noise and delay and cost everyone involved time and money. Rhett told Tessa about the countercomplaint over supper one evening, with the controlled frustration of a man who had been living with this for months and was running low on the particular patience that legal processes require. She's not going to stop, he said. She's going to drag this out as long as she can. I know, Tessa said. Does that mean she's winning? No, it means she's scared. She set down her fork. People who are confident they're going to prevail don't file countercomplaints. They wait. She's filing because she's trying to create confusion, and you only need confusion when the facts are against you. He looked at her. How are you this calm about this? She thought about that honestly. I'm not entirely calm, she said, but I know what we have. I know what I built, and I know that she's responding to it, which means it's working. She picked up her fork again. I just need you to hold your nerve for a while longer. My nerve is fine, he said, with a slight edge that suggested it was fine, but not abundant. I know, she said, and meant it. The countercomplaint was dismissed inside 2 weeks. The land office found it without merit given the existing investigation, and said so in language that was notably crisp for official correspondence. After that, events began to move with the gathered momentum of something that had been building for a long time. The sheriff's investigation confirmed what Tessa had documented. 3 of Blackthorne's former operatives, men who'd been used to approach struggling property owners, to supply false information to debt holders, and in at least 2 cases to apply more direct forms of pressure, faced charges. Purvis, in custody in Harlan, eventually made an arrangement with the county prosecutor that involved telling what he knew in exchange for consideration at sentencing. What he told them was not everything. He was careful, still, even cornered. but enough to confirm the coordination between his activities at Iron Mesa and Blackthorn's acquisition plans. The day Tessa heard about Purvis's statement, she was in the supply barn taking inventory. Pete was helping her, moving crates and calling out numbers while she wrote them down. And when Dutch appeared in the doorway and told her the deputy had sent word, she set her clipboard down and stood still for a moment. "You all right?" Pete said, in the slightly uncertain way of a 17-year-old, unsure whether an adult was about to cry or celebrate. "Yes," she said. "I just need a minute." She stepped outside into the afternoon light and stood beside the rebuilt eastern wall of the supply barn. They'd fixed it 3 weeks ago, Pete and Dutch working 2 days straight to get it done, and breathed in the spring air that smelled of grass and horses and the dry particular scent of the land around Dust Creek. She thought about Soto, who'd lost his cattle operation and hadn't had the words for why. She thought about the 5 other families. She thought about her father, which surprised her, not in grief exactly, but in the way you think of someone when you've done something that would have mattered to them. Then she went back inside and picked up her clipboard because the inventory wasn't going to finish itself. The formal resolution of Lenora Blackthorn's operation didn't happen in a single moment. It accumulated. Hearings, rulings, the slow grind of official processes, reaching conclusions that had been, in Tessa's estimation, inevitable from the moment she'd laid the documents on Garrett's desk. Blackthorn Land and Finance was found to have engaged in a pattern of predatory debt acquisition involving fraudulent manipulation of borrower circumstances across 3 counties. Lenora Blackthorn herself, who appeared for her hearing in Harlan, dressed with the careful precision of a woman who understood that appearance was its own kind of argument, faced a set of charges that her lawyer was not able to reduce to nothing, though he worked hard at it. The proceedings were not swift, but they were thorough, and the outcome when it came was not ambiguous. The Iron Mesa loan was voided on grounds of the fraud that had artificially created the conditions it was designed to exploit. The county land office reviewed the outstanding debt instruments held against 3 other properties and found similar issues. 2 of those properties were restored to their original owners. The third had already been sold on. That situation was more complicated and would take longer to resolve. Tessa received the official letter confirming the voiding of the Iron Mesa loan on a Thursday morning. She was at the desk in the office where she spent most of her mornings, and she read it twice, and then she sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then she got up and went to find Rhett. He was at the corral. He almost always was. She came and stood at the fence and held the letter out to him without a word. He took it and read it, standing in the corral with the reins of the gray horse loose in his other hand. She watched him read. He looked up. Something in his face had shifted. Not broken open exactly, not the dramatic release of a man who'd been holding himself together by force of will. More like a man who had been leaning against a very heavy door for a long time and had felt it stop pushing back. "It's done," he said. "The legal part," she said. "The rebuilding part still has a ways to go." He looked at her for a moment. Then very slightly, the corner of his mouth moved. "There she is," he said quietly. Not to her, not quite. Just to the air. "What?" "Nothing." He folded the letter carefully and handed it back. "Come look at this mare with me. She's been favoring her left front since yesterday, and I can't figure out what I'm missing." She looked at him. Then she put the letter in her pocket and climbed through the fence rails. Not over, through, because she wasn't particularly graceful about fences, and she'd stopped pretending otherwise somewhere around week 3 of living at Iron Mesa, and went to look at the horse. The sun was high and the yard was warm, and somewhere across the property Pete was whistling something off-key, and the mare stood patiently while they both crouched to examine her leg, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, arguing companionably about whether the issue was the pastern or the hoof itself. Neither of them mentioned the letter again that day, but it was in both their pockets, and they both knew it, and that was its own kind of conversation. The mare's problem turned out to be a small stone lodged in the frog of her left hoof, the kind of thing that was easy to miss and obvious once you found it. Rhett worked it free with a pick while Tessa held the horse's head, and the mare expressed her relief by exhaling heavily and trying to eat Tessa's coat pocket, which had crackers in it, because Tessa had discovered early in her time at Iron Mesa that having crackers in her pocket was useful for approximately 17 different situations. "She smells them," Rhett said, straightening up. She always smells them. Tessa pushed the mare's nose away without real force. You should have named her something less dignified. She doesn't live up to Duchess. My father named her. Well, your father had optimistic expectations. Rhett looked at the horse, then at Tessa, and the slight curve at the corner of his mouth was something she'd stopped pretending she didn't notice several weeks ago. That evening, after supper, he asked her to sit with him on the porch. This was not unusual. They'd developed the habit of it somewhere in the middle of everything, using the end of the day to talk through whatever needed talking through, and sometimes to not talk at all, which was its own kind of thing. But tonight he had the particular quality of stillness that she'd learned meant he was working up to something. She let him work up to it. She sat in the other chair and looked out at the yard going dark in the early summer evening, the fireflies just beginning in the grass near the creek line, and waited. I've been thinking, he said. About what? About the arrangement. He said it carefully. What we agreed to at the start. She looked at him. Her hands, in her lap, were still. The practical arrangement, she said. Yeah. He was looking out at the yard too, not at her. I want to change it. Something moved through her that she didn't immediately identify. Not alarm, not the particular wariness of a woman anticipating something unwanted, something more complicated than that, a bracing, like a person standing at the edge of unfamiliar ground and not yet sure whether the footing was solid. Change it how? She said. He was quiet for a moment longer. There was something almost painful about watching him find the words, not because he was inarticulate, but because she could tell he was trying to be accurate rather than impressive. And accuracy about this kind of thing was harder. I want you to have full ownership of this property, he said, not the legal half you already have on paper. I mean, the real version, the version where it's yours because you built it, not because we made a deal. He paused. And I want, if you want, something that's not an arrangement, something that's a choice, that you make because you want to, not because you needed a way out of a bad situation. She was quiet for a moment. Rhett, she said, you don't have to answer now. I'm not saying it to stall, she said. I'm saying it because I'm trying to figure out how to tell you something honestly, and I want to get it right. He looked at her then. I came here because I had $43 in a debt I couldn't pay, she said. That's the truth, and I'm not going to dress it up. I wasn't looking for this, any of this. I was looking for solid ground. She paused. And then I found it. And then I found that the ground had other things on it. Good things. She looked at him directly. I don't know exactly when it stopped being practical for me, but it did stop, some time ago. Something shifted in his face. Not performance. She'd seen enough performance from enough people in the past months to know the difference. This was the real version, a little unguarded, a little uncertain, the way real things usually looked. That's enough, he said. That's enough for me. She didn't say anything else right away, and neither did he. But when the fireflies in the grass by the creek got thick enough to be worth watching, she moved her chair a few inches in his direction without comment, and he didn't say anything about that either, and they sat there while the summer night came in around them and the land that had almost been taken from them breathed steadily under the stars. It wasn't a perfect moment. Her back hurt from a long day, and there were mosquitoes, and somewhere across the property, something was making a noise that probably meant Pete had left a gate unlatched again. But it was real, which was, she had come to understand, the better version of perfect. The letter from the county commissioner's office arrived 10 days later. She almost missed it in the stack of correspondence. The ranch generated a significant amount of paper these days, most of it considerably more positive than what she'd been reading in her first months at Iron Mesa, but still requiring daily attention. She'd have set it aside to deal with after the morning accounts if the seal on the envelope hadn't caught her eye. She opened it standing at the desk. It was from Commissioner Aldrich's office in Harlan, a formal letter, but not the kind she'd been bracing for over the past months. This one was different in tone from the first line. It acknowledged her role in the investigation that had exposed Blackthorn's operation across 3 counties. It referenced specifically the documentation she'd assembled and its role in enabling the county to act against what the letter called a systematic pattern of fraud that had adversely affected multiple property owners. And then it said something she had to read twice. The commissioner's office was in the process of establishing a county-level position for a financial investigator and property records auditor. a role that had been identified as necessary in the wake of the investigation's findings, given the demonstrated vulnerability of rural property owners to exactly the kind of scheme Blackthorn had been running. They were soliciting candidates. They wanted to know if she would be willing to be considered. She stood at the desk and read the letter a third time. Then she folded it, put it in her pocket, and went about her morning. She didn't tell Red about it immediately, not because she was hiding it, but because she needed to think about it in the unobserved way she did her best thinking, turning it over while her hands were busy with something else, letting her mind work on it without pressure. She thought about it while she did the accounts. She thought about it while she walked the south pasture that afternoon to check on the fencing Pete had finally gotten around to fixing, which was neat work, better than she'd expected from him. She thought about it while she helped Dutch sort through the supply inventory for next season's ordering, which was the kind of methodical task that freed up the other part of her brain to operate independently. What she kept arriving at was not an answer but a shape. The shape of who she'd been when she rode into Dust Creek with $43. And the shape of who she was now, and the distance between those two things. The woman on that buckboard had been surviving. She hadn't been building. She'd been responding to loss, Tico, her father, the farm, the life she'd expected, moving from one emergency to the next without any real sense that she was headed somewhere rather than just away from somewhere else. She wasn't sure exactly when that had changed. Sometime in those first weeks with the ledgers, maybe? Or the letters to the vendors? Or the ride to Harlan with documents in her saddlebag, wearing the smell of smoke from the barn fire. Somewhere in all of it, she'd stopped surviving and started building. And the difference between those two things was, she thought, the distance between being used by circumstances and using them instead. She told Red about the letter that evening. Same porch, same chairs. She handed it to him and watched him read. He read it twice. She'd expected that. It was something she'd noticed about him, that he read important things twice. And then he set it down on the arm of his chair and looked at the middle distance. "What do you want to do?" he said. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "What are the options as you see them?" She'd already worked this out. "I could decline and focus on the ranch. We're at the point where the operation is healthy enough that it doesn't need crisis management anymore. It needs steady, long-term administration, which I'm capable of providing, but which is different work." She paused. "Or I could accept the position, which would mean being in Harlan more than I'm here, at least initially. Probably significantly more. And the ranch? Needs a good manager, not necessarily me specifically. I can find someone, supervise the transition, stay involved in the decisions." She looked at him. "It wouldn't be what it's been, but I don't think it would fall apart." He was quiet for a moment. A cricket somewhere under the porch had started up with the reliable optimism of its kind. "What do you want?" he said again. "Not what are the options. What do you want?" She appreciated that he'd said it twice because it made clear he'd meant it the first time. "I think I want both," she said. "I think the position is... I think it matters. The reason it exists is because 6 families lost property they should have kept. And there will be more if no one is looking. There will always be more." She paused. "I know what it looks like. I know how to find it. That's not nothing." "It's not nothing," he agreed. "But I don't want to leave here." She said it plainly, without performance. "I didn't expect to feel that. And I do." Rhett looked at her with the careful, even attention that was one of the things she'd come to trust most about him. The way he listened without reorganizing what he heard into what he wanted it to mean. "Harlan is 3 hours," he said. "I know. That's not impossible." "No," she said. "It's not. And if you built something there that worked, the kind of oversight you're describing, eventually it wouldn't need you in it full-time either. You'd have set it up and moved on." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "That's what you did here." She looked at him. She hadn't thought of it exactly that way. That what she'd done at Iron Mesa was not just solve a problem, but build a functioning system that would continue operating after the crisis had passed. That maybe that was the thing she was actually good at. Not just fixing what was broken, but creating something that was harder to break in the first place. "I'll write back," she said. "Tell them I'm interested in discussing terms." "Good," he said. She looked at him a moment longer. "You're sure?" "Tessa." He met her eyes. The woman I want here is the one who takes that letter seriously. If you turned it down because you thought I needed you to stay, that would bother me a great deal more than you spending 3 days a week in Harlan." She was quiet for a moment, absorbing that. 3 days a week is optimistic for the early stages, she said. I figured, he said. The reply from Commissioner Aldrich's office came within the week, and the terms they proposed were serious ones. This was not a ceremonial acknowledgement of her role in the investigation. They wanted her working. They wanted the thing she'd built, applied beyond Iron Mesa, scaled to something that could actually hold. She negotiated. She'd have been embarrassed not to. She asked for a formal charter that gave the position genuine authority rather than advisory status. The difference between someone who could identify fraud and someone who could actually require documentation from property records offices across the county. She asked for a budget that would allow her to hire an assistant because she'd learned at Iron Mesa that the work of documenting financial crimes was fundamentally a volume problem, and one person moving through it alone was always going to be too slow. She asked for a provision that allowed her to continue her role at Iron Mesa in an ownership and oversight capacity, arguing, correctly, that maintaining actual experience with a functioning ranch operation would make her better at identifying irregularities in others. Aldrich's office agreed to most of it. They pushed back on the budget, which she'd expected, and they negotiated down, which she'd also expected, and they landed somewhere she could work with. She signed the appointment letter on a Tuesday morning in the Harlan Commissioner's office, and Commissioner Aldrich, a thick-set man in his 60s who had the reputation of being difficult and the reality of being simply precise, shook her hand across the desk and said, "We should have had someone doing this work years ago." "Yes," she said, "you should have." He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who'd expected more deference from that answer, and then, unexpectedly, he laughed, a short, genuine sound. "You'll do fine," he said. She rode home in the late afternoon and arrived at Iron Mesa as the sun was getting low, painting the grassland in the reddish-gold light that made the territory look, at certain hours, like something out of a painting rather than a working piece of land covered in actual dirt and actual problems. She unsaddled Carl and brushed him down and put him up, and found Rhett and Dutch in the barn in the middle of an argument about the best approach to repairing the north pasture gate, which had been a recurring disagreement for approximately as long as she'd been at the ranch. "She's back," Pete said, appearing from the direction of the tack room. "I can see that," Rhett said, looking at her. "How'd it go?" "I signed," she said. Dutch nodded, once the way Dutch acknowledged most information of significance, without ceremony, but with weight. "They give you what you needed?" Rhett said. "Close enough." "When do you start?" 3 weeks, after I've set up the transition plan for the ranch management." She looked at him. "I have a candidate in mind, actually. Woman in Dust Creek, Mrs. Ford's niece, as it happens. She's been doing bookkeeping for the general store, and she's been underpaid and underchallenged for 2 years. I'd like to bring her out here for a week and see how she takes to the work." Rhett looked at her with something that was not quite amusement and not quite exasperation, and was, she'd concluded, the specific expression he wore when she'd been thinking several steps ahead of the conversation they were currently having. "You already talked to her," he said. "Last week," Tessa said. "I wanted to know if she was interested before I proposed it to you." "And? She's very interested." Tessa looked at Dutch. "I'll need you to cooperate with her the way you cooperated with me." Dutch looked faintly pained. "I cooperated with you fine." "You cooperated with me after 3 weeks of deciding whether I was worth cooperating with," she said. A pause. "She goes through you or Mr. Calloway if she has questions that matter," Dutch said, "and she doesn't touch my stable schedules." "Reasonable," Tessa said. Pete was grinning at the whole exchange from the doorway of the tack room in the way of someone watching a tennis match. She pointed at him. "The south fence gate." He stopped grinning. "I latched it." "I know you latched it. Latch it better." He retreated into the tack room. The first 6 months of the new position were the hardest work she'd done since the early days at Iron Mesa, which was saying something. She spent the first month building the actual operating structure from the ground up. The filing systems, the reporting protocols, the relationships with county clerks and land office staff that would determine whether she could actually get the access and cooperation the work required. Some of those relationships came easily. Others required the specific patience of a person who understands that institutions move slowly and that being right about something is not the same as being able to act on it quickly. She found 2 cases of predatory debt structuring in the first 3 months. Neither was as sophisticated as what Blackthorn had been running. They were simpler, more opportunistic. But both involved families that were in real danger of losing property they'd worked for years. In the first case, she was able to intervene early enough that a legal challenge to the loan terms prevented foreclosure. In the second case, she was 2 months too late to stop the initial loss, but she built a case strong enough that the county was able to require the creditor to offer resale terms that gave the original family a path back. Not a complete victory, but not nothing either. She rode back to Iron Mesa every few days, sometimes every week, depending on what was pressing in Harlan. The routine of those rides became something she valued. The 3 hours of movement and open land between one version of her life and the other, time that belonged to neither, and let her brain sort itself out. Sometimes she thought about her father on those rides, about the Holloway farm and what it had felt like to walk away from it. Not the grief, which had been straightforward and which she'd processed in the way of practical people doing the necessary things while the feeling ran underneath, but the specific humiliation of having something taken. The particular injury of losing not just a place, but the identity that had been attached to it. She understood now, in a way she hadn't at the time, that the identity had been the real loss. The land was land. What the land had meant, the sense of being someone with a place in the world, someone whose work had a permanent home, that was what she'd actually been grieving when she rode into Dust Creek on that mule with $43 in her pocket. What she hadn't known then was that you could build it again, not recover it. It wasn't the same thing. The rebuilt version never was. But build something new that held the same weight, that was made of different materials but served the same function, which was, I am here. This is mine. I made this. She thought the thing most people didn't understand about losing everything was that it felt like an ending because it was won. But endings were the only way new things started. You couldn't build the second version while the first one still existed. The Holloway farm had to go for Tessa Holloway to become the person who could run Iron Mesa and catch financial criminals and sit on a porch in the summer dark feeling, for the first time in a long time, like herself. She wasn't sure she'd have chosen it, but she'd stopped spending energy wishing it had gone differently. The following spring, Dust Creek had its annual town assembly, a gathering that served the overlapping purposes of community business, social obligation, and organized gossip that frontier towns tended to require in the absence of other entertainment. Tessa went because Rhett went, and because the ranch had business to discuss with 2 neighboring property owners, and because she'd found in her first year at Iron Mesa that being present for the ordinary business of the community was something that mattered to people in ways that had nothing to do with the specific business being conducted. She sat through 2 hours of land boundary disputes and a lengthy argument about the positioning of a new water trough on the main street. She contributed when the conversation turned to a topic she knew something about, and was quiet when it didn't, and drank bad coffee because that was what was available. Afterward, in the general dispersal that followed these events, she found herself in a conversation with a group of people she recognized from town. The merchant Garvey, who'd processed her marriage paperwork almost a year ago, a woman named Cleary who ran the boarding house, and a man she didn't know who turned out to be a new arrival from the east. The new arrival asked how long she'd been in Dust Creek. Before she could answer, Garvey said, "Mrs. Calloway's been here about a year. She's the one who ran down that Blackthorn business. You'd have heard about it if you came through Harlan." The man nodded. "I did hear about it, actually. Didn't realize—" He looked at Tessa with the frank reassessment of someone updating a prior assumption. "That was your work?" "Most of it," she said. "My husband and several good people at the ranch were part of it." "Still," he said, "that's significant." She didn't know what to do with that exactly, so she said something modest and moved on to the next conversation. But she was aware afterward of the slight strangeness of it, the way a community's memory worked, how a year ago these same people had looked at her as a problem without a category, and now the category had been filled in and the looking was different. She didn't need it the way she might have once. She was glad of it, which was a different and better thing than needing it. Rhett found her on the boardwalk outside the general store a little later, her coat pulled around her against the spring wind, watching Main Street do its afternoon business. "Ready?" he said. Almost. She watched a wagon go past. Do you remember the day I arrived? Vividly, he said. Your mule stopped in the middle of the street and you pulled him by the halter like it was his fault he existed. It was his fault. George has a strong sense of self. George is difficult and I've never pretended otherwise. She looked up at him. You didn't know anything about me. You just had a notice on a post in a desperate situation and you sat in the back of a saloon and decided to trust a stranger. You didn't know anything about me either, he said. You went through my books and decided the situation was recoverable. That was trust too. It was arithmetic. Tessa. He looked at her with the steady directness she'd come to rely on more than she'd ever expected to rely on anyone. It was trust. You just dressed it up in numbers because that's how you're built. She thought about that. The wind came down the street and pushed at her coat and moved something in the dry grass at the edge of the road. I'm built like that because it works, she said. I know, he said. It's one of my favorite things about you. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked away, because she still wasn't entirely comfortable with being looked at while receiving something she meant, which was a flaw she was aware of and working on and hadn't fully fixed. Let's go home, she said. The word still felt slightly new in her mouth. Not wrong. It hadn't felt wrong in a long time, but still new, the way a good tool felt new before it became familiar, before you stopped noticing it and just used it. Home. They rode back to Iron Mesa in the late afternoon light with the sky doing the thing it did in spring out here, colors running from gold to rose to the deep blue of incoming evening, spread across a horizon so wide it made everything under it feel small in the particular way that was clarifying rather than diminishing. The land rolled out in every direction, dry grass brown still shaking off winter. The line of willows along Decker Creek, a dark thread through the middle distance. 900 acres, 3 generations of work pressed into the soil, hers too, now. Not by arrangement, by the harder route, by choosing it, again and again, in small ways and large ones, through months of work and doubt and the specific courage it took to stay in a place that hadn't asked for you until you'd made yourself impossible to dismiss. She thought about the woman on the buckboard at the start of all this, hollow-eyed, debt-heavy, bracing for the next bad thing. She didn't feel sorry for that woman exactly. She felt something closer to kinship, the way you felt about a version of yourself that had survived something you were glad was behind you. That woman had done the work to become this one. The debt, the mule, the $43, all of it had been the specific and necessary path to a morning in a ranch office, with a lamp and a ledger and a problem she could actually solve. She hadn't chosen the hard parts, but she had chosen what to do with them every single time. That was the only version of a life that was actually yours, not the one that went the way you planned, but the one you built with whatever the world dropped in front of you, piece by unglamorous piece, until you looked up one day and found that what you'd made was something worth the making. Iron Mesa came into view as the light got low. The main house first, then the barn, then the outbuildings and the corral and the smoke from the bunkhouse stovepipe where someone, probably Pete, was starting supper too early again. It looked, in the evening light, like something that had always been there and intended to keep being there. She nudged Carl toward the stable and felt, without drama or ceremony, the specific quiet satisfaction of a person arriving somewhere they belonged. Behind her, Rhett rode in easy and unhurried, the gray horse moving at its usual unimpressed pace, and the gate swung shut behind them both with the solid sound of iron on iron, and the ranch settled into its evening routines. And Tessa Holloway, who had arrived with nothing but a calculation and a stubborn refusal to accept that nothing was what she deserved, was home.